Hello, this is Manny Ramos, your host of Rise Up, Real Issues and Stories of Every One of Us podcast. First, let me talk about who we are. I'm Manny Ramos, a board member of PNAA, a past president of the Philippine Nurses Association of Central Florida. I'm a professor of nursing at Valencia College in Orlando and an adjunct faculty at William Patterson University. With me today is my co-host, Mindy Ofiana. Mindy?
Thank you, Manny. Welcome, everyone. I'm Mindy Ofiana, Legislative Committee Chair of PNAA and a corresponding secretary for PNAA Foundation, and a past president of PNA Southern California, and an adjunct professor at Charles R. Drew University, Department of Medicine and Sciences.
Mhm.
Our guest tonight is Dr. Marlon Garzo Saria. He's a regional vice president of the Philippine Nurses Association of America, overseeing operations in the Western region comprised of 16 chapters and 2 sub-chapters with over 800 members. He's a nurse scientist and the director of professional practice of Providence St. John's Health Center. Marlon is also an assistant professor at St. John Cancer Institute and Pacific Neuroscience Institute in California. He extends influence by developing and implementing nursing practice and protocol standards, providing nursing expertise and input into formulating departmental policies, participating in strategic planning, and establishing an evidence based practice expectation and focus for professional nursing practice. He serves as a deputy chief nurse for the 452nd Aeromedical Staging Squadron, U.S. Air Force Reserve, overseeing training, employment, and standards of practice for nurses and medical technicians. Dr. Saria is a thought leader in professional, military, community, and education settings, saving served in leadership roles in professional organizations and multi-professional military services and social, civic, political organizations. Through diverse clinical and leadership experiences nationally and internationally, he has made significant contributions to professional, community, and academic environments to advance patient care, create innovative work environments, promote scholarship in practitioners, and develops leaders. He is an advanced oncology clinical nurse specialist and a nurse professional development board certified. He's also a fellow at the American Academy of Nursing. Good afternoon, Dr. Saria Marlon. Welcome to Rise Up.
Good afternoon, Mindy and Manny. Thank you for having me. Really, really happy to be here tonight.
Nice to see you, Marlon. How are you?
I am well. It's a little busy. I'm sure everyone is. So just a lot of things going on at the same time.
That's true.
We had that 2 years with the pandemic, and I think we're all catching up
Yeah,
on the work that important work that we didn't do while we were facing the pandemic the past 2 years. We still are facing the
that's
pandemic,
right.
but it's just a lot of work.
That's right. Well, we're
Yeah.
so glad to have you here, and we're excited to talk with what you do and know a little bit more about you. And I want to share to I want to start our conversation by having you share with our audience your background. Please tell us something about yourself, where you grew up, and of course, your journey into the United States.
Wow, that probably will take the entire hour, so I'll try to cut it really short. Most of us have our life stories, right?
Yeah.
But I'll be brief. So I was born and raised in Parañaque in the
Mhm.
Philippines. My mom is from Bacolod, my dad is from Cavite City, and then they met in Baclaran.
Oh,
Oh,
A lot of folks who actually lived in the Philippines know Baclaran as the place where the national shrine of the Mother Perpetual Help is.
mm.
yes.
So I was a stone throws away from that church, and then that was the church where every Wednesday my mom and I would
Oh,
go.
wow.
Mm.
Uh, I'll jump right straight into going to the U.S. My grandfather was here. He was a veteran of World War II,
Oh.
survivor of the on death march. That's what actually was able to bring him here.
Oh.
And he petitioned my father. So my father, my mother, and I came here. I actually wanted to stay back home in the Philippines. I did not want to come
Oh.
here
Oh.
at that time because you know how it is in the
Mm-hmm.
Philippines,
Right.
right? You have a lot of friends.
Yeah.
You just want to hang out with them. I didn't really want to grow up. I'd rather just stay home and then hang out with friends. But I'm glad I did
Uh-huh.
because coming here changed my life. Obviously,
Mhm.
it changed my life and gave me meaning
Mhm.
to my life and something to live for. And that's through nursing and that's through the military and everything else that Mindy mentioned during the introduction that gave me a reason to live.
Right.
Uh, yeah.
I see.
Cool.
Oh, that's nice to hear. Anyway, as a nurse scientist, especially in the field of oncology, research studies or clinical trials are an essential part of cancer treatment. What are clinical trials?
Clinical trials. So, you know, I have an answer, right? Clinical trials, research, we have an answer. We have money and I, uh, we teach students, so we have that textbook response to what research is, generalizable knowledge.
Mhm.
But can I ask you, and there are no wrong answers. So if I ask Manny and Mindy, like, what are clinical trials to you? And I'll go from there. If you just humor me for a minute,
They are
what do you think are clinical
they are
trials?
research studies to determine if a
Mm-hmm.
treatment is working.
Mhm.
Okay.
A treatment or a medication.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to emphasize.
Yeah.
If you ask a lot of people about clinical trials, their idea of a clinical trial is a drug study,
Hmm.
right? So really, clinical trials are more formal investigations into interventions. I think we have mostly a nursing audience, so they would get this. If we have more public audience attending this, then
Could be.
uh, it probably we'll need to say it differently. But since we have a lot of nurses,
Yeah.
it's really a formal investigation into interventions, and the interventions does not necessarily need to be medications.
Mhm.
But that is the first thing we always think about when we think of clinical trials.
Right.
It's drug trials, drug experiments, right? Looking at investigational drugs that have not been approved by the FDA yet. Sounds familiar? Vaccines? uh,
That's right.
right. So that's what the general public thinks. But clinical trials release a broad
Mm.
range of studies that does not only look at treatment or treating a disease. We have clinical trials that look at how do we prevent disease?
Hmm.
Right.
What are the vitamins that we need to take? What kinds of exercises? How long? How often?
Mhm.
Uh, so those are all considered in the realm of clinical trials. We have diagnostic treatments. Is an X-ray better than MRI? Or maybe I said that the other way around. Is an
Mhm.
MRI better than an X-ray?
Hmm.
We know that an MRI is more expensive, X-ray is less expensive, but there are risks inherent to those imaging
Uh-huh.
uh, technologies.
Right.
Uh, there are clinical trials looking at survival, quality of life, side effects to drugs. So clinical trial is really broad, and it's not just looking at one drug and seeing if
Mhm.
this drug is effective for us.
Right. Well, so Marlon, our audiences may ask, well, what is the value of conducting clinical trials?
So, value of clinical trials.
Yeah.
Do you know anyone who was diagnosed with cancer and is still alive today?
Yeah.
Do you know anyone who was diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer and still alive today?
Mm.
May not be personal that you know, but there's one celebrity that I know of who has a bike.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yes. The yellow bike.
Right. Yeah. So if you look at the outcomes that we have, Mindy, Tour de France.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Oh.
The survivors, the rates of survivors that we have, and pardon me, like most of my examples will be related to cancer, obviously, because
Hmm.
that's my
Mhm.
specialty.
Hmm.
But clinical trials exist in other specialties as well. But that the increase in survivors and the increase in outcomes, better outcomes that we're seeing right now, it's all because of clinical trials. And like I said, it's not just because of the drugs,
Hmm.
but everything else that we do clinical trials with, including disease prevention, symptom symptom management, and anything in that disease trajectory that we share with our patients or tell our patients.
Mhm.
Uh, so that's importance of clinical trials. I'll throw some numbers. Some of them may not be accurate. Let me just say that because I don't know the numbers offhand. But it should be fairly close.
Mhm.
80% of pediatric patients are surviving leukemias. Back
Oh,
in the
wow. Yes.
1950s, 1960s, that number was maybe 50, 60%.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
So we've increased that to 80%, maybe even pushing up to 90, higher, lower 90s
Mm.
in terms of survival. And that because of clinical trials that we have done in pediatric patients, that they're surviving longer into adulthood, actually. Uh,
I see.
Breast cancer rates
Uh-huh.
were at
Mm-hmm.
90%, 5-year survival,
Right.
over 90%, maybe even pushing up closer to almost 100 in terms of 5-year survival rate, again, because of clinical trials. I mentioned two, I'm going to call them diseases, but two conditions,
Mhm.
pediatrics
Mm-hmm.
and breast cancer, that we really have really improved our outcomes on.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and might you know why?
Why?
Because of clinical trials. Those are the two
Oh.
conditions that we have a clinical trials on.
Mhm.
Oh.
Pediatric cancers, because most of the kids that get cancer go to pediatric hospitals,
Mm-hmm.
children's hospitals, right? And those children's hospitals will host the clinical trials. So a vast majority of them are actually invited or offered to participate in
Mhm.
a clinical trial.
Mm.
Breast cancer, because and I apologize and I hope that this will not be taken out of context, because women are loud, right? And
I.
women are loud. They know how to advocate for
Uh-huh.
themselves. I am not going to be political right now, but and I used to say this a lot without even thinking of politics. But what do you think of when I say pink? Breast cancer before before the elections in the Philippines, right? When you see pink, breast cancer.
Yeah.
Uh, because pink is related to breast cancer, and then women have known how to advocate for themselves. They
Mm-hmm.
have the pink ribbons and pink
Mhm.
balloons and pink t-shirts, and they have raised lots and lots of funds
Mhm.
that have funded all these clinical trials that have now improved survival rates for cancer, for
Yeah.
breast cancer.
Mm. That's
We don't
true.
see the same thing for the other cancers,
Mhm.
unfortunately.
Mm.
That's true.
That's
Like in
true.
my specialty, we have brain cancer. Gray is the color for brain cancer.
Yeah.
That's so dull. Like no
Oh,
one likes to see the color
agree.
gray.
That's true.
And there's not as much noise around it
Mhm.
in terms of funding when you compare that uh, to breast cancer.
I see.
So you could see how those two conditions and the clinical trials, just because we have more robust trials with those two conditions, how the outcomes have improved, significantly improved,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the other cancers that maybe do not have uh, a lot more options or clinical trials available for
Okay.
them. So for me, that is, if you ask about the importance of clinical trials, it's outcomes.
Yeah.
I see. That's
Yeah.
great news, though, to hear that
Yeah.
90 and 80% survival
Survival
rate, if you
rates.
will. So, how do clinical trials works? And did the operations of clinical trials change during the pandemic crisis?
Yeah. So those are two different questions.
Yeah,
If I forget the second question, remind me
sure.
later.
It will be a follow-up question.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Too young to forget, Marlon.
Right. So it's I always also have to say, and I tell my patients these as well. Uh, we take for granted the drugs that are FDA approved, that you can go to CVS or Walgreens or Walmart or Target pharmacy. All those drugs have been through clinical trials,
Mm.
and based on the I forgot what pharma stands for, PHRMA, Pharmaceutical Association of America. Uh, it takes about 15 to 17 years to
Oh,
develop a single drug.
wow.
So that's a very long time. We're trying to reduce that time right now with all the initiatives that's going
Mhm.
on, and I think your podcast is uh, very highly related to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
and all of us is directly result of the precision medicine initiative, right? So that initiative is trying to reduce that time, the 15 to 17 years. Some people say 12 to 17 years. I've heard others say 8 to 17 years. Regardless, it's a lot of years,
Yeah.
especially if you get diagnosed with a disease. You can't wait 8 years,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's 8 years. You can't wait 8 years for a drug. Uh, so it takes that much time and so much money,
Mm-hmm.
like almost to the tune of $300 million for one drug.
Oh.
And I've seen estimates that goes up to $2 billion for
Wow.
one drug. And that
Wow.
includes the cost of everything. To
Right.
develop one drug. That includes the cost of the failed drugs, the cost of uh, obviously the human factors and human variables,
Yeah.
and everything related to laboratory. So lots of time, lots of money
Mm-hmm.
uh, for clinical trials
Mm-hmm.
because of this, because of the phases. So Mindy's question was,
Did the
how do
op
clinical
yeah.
trials work?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Right.
yeah.
So we look at targets in the human body. So we may have molecules, we may have proteins that may correlate to a disease. Uh, and the scientists who have worked behind the scenes will try to figure out a drug that can hit the target. I'm just trying to make it really simple.
Mm-hmm.
And so they do the pre-human work first of clinical trials,
Mm-hmm.
uh, looking at first defining that target.
Mm-hmm.
Second is developing a drug or a molecule that can hit the target, and then they will do the preclinical trial testing, first in vitro and then in vivo, or in other words, in test tubes and platters, and
Mm-hmm.
then in animal studies before we even start the clinical trials in humans.
Mm-hmm.
When we go to the human phase of the clinical trials, that's everyone. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 trials,
Right.
right? Phase 1 trials is just looking at drug efficacy, if this drug is effective. Sorry, I take that back. It's looking at safety.
Mm-hmm.
No, uh, it, we don't really not care if it's efficacious, but the real goal of a phase 1 trial is to look at safety, that we can safely give this molecule to a human and not kill the human, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So that's phase 1. Phase 2 is when we start looking at efficacy. So we know that this drug is safe at this dose. Does it work?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the basic question. Phase 3 is when we compare the drug to standard of care. So that's, we already have treatments for breast cancer. We have adriamycin and cyclophosphamide as a combination drug that we use for breast cancer. That's pretty standard. So that's the standard of care. Now we've developed this other drug. I'm not even going to make up a drug. So is this drug alone equally as effective as the standard of care?
Mm-hmm.
Is it better if we add it to standard of care? So that's phase 3, comparing it to standard of care. It's very important also to mention that in phase 3, or maybe we can talk about this later, about placebos.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot of the concerns that people have about clinical trials is placebos. Uh, Technically, there's no placebo in cancer, and I can explain myself later. In any cancer studies, there's technically not a placebo arm, because you will always have the standard of care regardless. We cannot not treat the patient. That's unethical, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to make that clear maybe when we talk about barriers, if we're going to talk
Mm-hmm.
about barriers. But for now, phase 3 trial is just comparing the new drug, or maybe a new dose of the drug, or maybe a new formulation of the drug. If we were giving it IV before, we're going to look at how to give it orally. If that works, at least uh, equivalent with the standard of care or better than standard of care. And then
Mm-hmm.
phase 4 is after it has been approved by the FDA. Phase 4 is just looking at post-marketing studies and seeing if there are any side effects that we may not have noticed during the trials, just to continue evaluating the safety and efficacy of the drugs. That's why it takes about
Mm-hmm.
17 years.
I see.
All those things just to get the subjects to get through those clinical trials.
Right.
So my follow-up question is based on what you just said. Did the operations change during the pandemic
Right.
crisis?
It did. It did
Oh.
in many ways. Especially during the early parts of the pandemic, where patients are not even coming to the hospitals at that time.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about 2 weeks. I'm talking about months. That patients were not going to the hospitals. That most of the uh, clinical trial evaluations or appointments or evaluations are done online, which when you talk about clinical trials, it's not really a safe way to do things. You really need to be able to assess patients face to face or in person at least. So that's one. The barriers that the organizations have set up to protect the
Mhm.
patients. Right, we've set up those barriers, but we're really protecting the patients so that they don't go to a hospital and contract COVID in the early phases of the pandemic. Uh, the other barrier is the patients themselves. And even now, we're in March of 2022, that there's still some hesitancy in some patients, maybe being around hospitals, medical centers. I don't know how true that is, but there's still some hesitancy. But definitely the pandemic has affected clinical trial participation and uh, oncology care or cancer care in general. My biggest fear is during the past 2 years, uh, maybe outside of the clinical trial conversation that we're having right now, is how many patients have missed their screening appointments. And is that going to lead with an increase in diagnosis the next couple of months once those patients start to come back and have their screening tests done?
That's true.
So we'll see. We'll
Mhm.
see.
So, Marlon, our audiences may also ask, what are the potential benefits of participating in a clinical trial?
I always start with the uh, altruistic uh, reward,
Mhm.
if you even call it a reward. If it's a reward, then it's not altruistic anymore. but the altruistic benefits of being in a clinical trial is that you're providing data. You're providing information so that the next person who may get this condition
Mhm.
will have more
Yeah.
options, right? So you're contributing to that, and it's for the benefit of humanity.
Okay.
When I talked about the phases of clinical trials, there is a an ethical question on I am blanking on the term right now. Therapeutic. What was the word that we use? Uh, Therapeutic misconception is that patients think that when they sign up for a clinical trial, is that it's for them to get better. But remember, we talked about the phases of clinical
Mhm.
trials.
Yeah.
Phase one is only looking at safety. So if they
Mhm.
think that they're getting into a clinical trial to get rid of the cancer,
Mhm.
it may be a side benefit of being in the trial, but really what we're evaluating for a phase one trial is safety,
Safety.
right? So it really it really is more an altruistic way of contributing information so that we will have a lot more options. But in doing that, you may have some benefits, not
Mhm.
necessarily guaranteed, obviously, that this particular drug or regimen or combination or uh, maybe an imaging
Mhm.
technique or radiation or whatever it is will be beneficial.
Mm. So let me ask the dark side of the question. What would be the potential risk
Mhm.
of participating in clinical trials?
Yeah, so there are many, depending on the
Yeah.
interventions that they will sign up for, obviously.
Yeah.
Even if we have done the animal studies, right? And I could talk more if we have time about how do we even figure out a dose.
Mhm. Yeah.
So with animal studies, you start with the smallest dose, and then you slowly increase the dose until it gets. I'm overly simplifying it. It's not that simple, but you slowly increase the dose until you see adverse events in our animal models.
Mhm.
And then when you start in humans, you start at 10% of that dose that started the adverse events in animals.
Mhm.
So it's you go back to the smaller dose when you started in humans, just to make sure to be really, really safe and make sure that we're taking the different biologics, biological conditions into consideration. But there are still those side effects that may come up
Mm-hmm.
that may or may not be expected based on the pharmacology, if you will, of the drug or the intervention. So there's those side effects. There are other maybe psychosocial side effects that uh, patients or participants may have being involved with the clinical trial, a lot of ethical issues, especially now with genetics and genomics. Uh,
Mm.
it just opens up. And then obviously there's that one that the human subjects or IRB always talks about is uh, confidentiality and
Mhm.
patient information, personal protected information uh, that may be out there. Although I don't, I don't want to scare people not to participate in trials because of all that. We have safeguards,
Mhm.
but
Mm.
obviously nothing is 100% safe, right? Nothing is 100% safe. So we need to make sure that uh, we are informing all participants of the risk when they sign up for a clinical trial.
Mm.
So, Marlon, for any of our interested audiences, how can they participate in a clinical trial?
If you are a uh, a savvy uh, online, looking online,
Uh-huh.
then there's clinicaltrials.gov. So you could put in the
Ah.
condition that you're looking for a clinical trial for. If you've already heard of a drug, let's say CNN or Fox News have talked of a
Mhm.
drug, and you want to take advantage of that drug and you want to know more about that, then you can either type in the drug or your condition.
Mhm.
And clinicaltrials.gov is really as a repository of all the clinical trials internationally, not just in the United States. But sometimes you need to filter, and there's going to be a lot of information, so you will need uh, a specialist
Mhm.
in that condition to actually look through those studies just to help filter what may be appropriate for you, not only in terms of the trials and the drugs, but also in terms of what's closer to you.
Mhm.
So if I'm in LA, I'm in Los Angeles, and if a trial is available in MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas, am I willing to make that trip to be part of that trial,
Mhm.
or is it maybe available at UCLA,
Right.
which is next to me? So we need to consider all those things when looking at clinical trials to clinicaltrials.gov.
Mhm.
And again, let's say if you're comfortable looking online,
Yeah.
Yes.
there's going to be a lot of other websites out there. I cannot guarantee uh, the contents of those websites, but I can guarantee clinicaltrials.gov because that is definitely vetted by the government,
Uh-huh.
and then the experts actually are looking into that. And then there's your healthcare team.
Mhm.
So always ask your healthcare team. There are hospitals that have navigators, patient navigators. So ask
Mhm.
them, ask your physicians, because they would know how to refer and where to refer you for
Mhm.
those clinical trials. That's within your area, or if there's one that may benefit you that's outside your immediate area, then they should be able to refer to you as well.
Sometimes
And
even
NIH,
even if they're
yeah,
not near that, sometimes just because some patients I don't want to call it desperate, but if they're,
right.
let's say it's in St. Louis and they live, let's say here in Florida, but that is the only place where the clinical trial is
They're
being
going.
implemented.
Right.
Sometimes they go and fly in, don't they, and stay there.
They do. They do.
Yeah.
And yeah, if cost is a barrier,
Mhm.
then the clinical trials, because they need the patients, right? They need
Mhm.
the participants to be able to get the data to show that their drug is effective.
Mhm.
That they will cover those expenses. And I can tell you for sure one place that I know of that does that.
Mhm.
It's a government facility in Bethesda. We all know the NIH, the
Right.
Clinical Research Center, the
Yeah.
NIH.
Yeah.
So any study that is provided by the NIH, if it requires travel to Bethesda, then they will pay for the airfare and the hotel for you and your caregiver.
Yeah.
Mm.
Uh, so that those are parts of the protocols that are written to be able to accrue or
Mhm.
get more subjects and participants to participate in the trial, so that we could close the trials early and find out if drugs are effective or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. I used to work at City of Hope here at Duarte, California, and
Yes.
patients would come with rims and rims of papers and say, "Doctor, here are some new drugs
Mhm.
for
Right.
is that will this be effective
Mhm.
for me?" And sort of that. But
Right.
anyway, I read that most patients, adult specifically, do not participate in
Mhm.
clinical trials. Why so?
That's that's the million-dollar question, right? Like I said, if we could get the adults to participate, then we probably would have better outcomes for the other cancers as well. I mentioned the pediatric population earlier, and the participation rate in pediatric patients is higher. And I mentioned why.
Mhm.
Children's hospitals. So
Mm.
there's not a lot of freestanding pediatric clinics that treat cancer in kids. If you have a child with cancer, then you go to a children's hospital close to you, and those are the academic medical centers for kids. So they offer the clinical trials. When you compare that to adults, not everyone, and then I'll use the examples of where I live, right? Not everyone will go to UCLA or to City of Hope. We have private offices, private clinics, private oncologists that may not have those options of clinical trials, although many of them will refer to these big academic medical centers, but not a lot of those freestanding oncology clinics will refer or will be able to offer clinical trials. So that's number one, just the availability of clinical trials for adults because of just the sheer number of centers that we have. Uh, Second is a lot of the barriers that we've seen and we still are seeing. Uh, I just need to say one word and it'll exactly know what I mean. Vaccines. A lot of people still are not taking the vaccines, right, because of that distrust or mistrust
Mhm.
with authorities, even healthcare authorities. So we see the same in clinical trials that they don't trust the process. They think that they're guinea pigs
Mhm.
that we're
Uh-huh.
experimenting on. Uh, and that's why I want to make sure to let everyone know that these drugs go through a rigorous process, which I have
Mhm.
already explained earlier, going from preclinical to phase 1, 2, 3, and 4
Mhm.
before we even approve them for use in humans. Uh,
Mhm.
One of the barriers, not as common, but I hear it frequently, fairly frequently, is I don't want to participate in the clinical trials because I will be assigned to the placebo arm,
Mhm.
right? And I
Mm.
said that I may go back to this, so thank you for asking that. So in cancer, there's no placebo arm technically.
Mhm.
Like I said, we cannot not treat the patient just to see if this new investigational drug is working. So patient may get a placebo or maybe in the placebo arm,
Mhm.
but they're still getting the standard of care,
Yeah.
whatever the standard of care is for that particular condition, right? Uh, and then the other patient will get the intervention or whatever the
Mhm.
experimental agent or experimental treatment, whether it's radiation or whatever it is, uh, with or without the standard of care.
Mhm.
So there, we don't just leave a patient hanging. Like you're in the
Uh-huh.
placebo arm. Sorry, we're not going to give you anything. No, they'll get the standard of care regardless. Uh, at least in the oncology field. So the placebo arm should not be an issue. But like you said, Mindy, there are patients who would come with pages upon pages of information, and they say that I want this drug, and if I'm on this clinical
Mhm.
trial, I want to make sure that I get the drug, and I'm not in the placebo arm.
Yeah.
And that will turn them away unless you can guarantee them being in the therapeutic arm, which defeats the purpose of the protocol and uh, breaks some ethical
Mhm.
issues that we have in terms of blinding studies. Uh, there's care delivery system issues as well.
Mhm.
Uh, in
Oh.
network, out of network. I'm not going to mention, which networks have a lot of clinical trial, which networks doesn't. But if you have an insurance that does not have a lot of clinical trials available for your condition, then you have to go through hoops just to go to another hospital that may be able to offer you that clinical trial, right? Because you just happen to have the wrong insurance. Uh, so that's an issue as well. Cost is an issue, and still a lot of people think that clinical trials is a last ditch effort to save them. So they'll say like, I'll try every standard of care first, and if none of it work, then I'll go clinical trials. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, though, that's not how we should think. Like we should think clinical trials upfront, plus because again, we've looked at these drugs, we've studied these drugs. So if you're part of a phase 3 trial comparing it to a standard of care, then there might be benefit to you upfront that you may have missed if you waited until the very end before you sign up for a clinical trial, and by that time it might be too late.
Mhm.
So I'm going to ask the last question, Marlon. What advice would you give cancer patients or any of our viewers and listeners related to communicating with their doctor about trials, clinical trials?
So, and I always have a props when I talk to patients. Like, I can't find a pen right here.
Mhm.
Write down your questions.
Uh-huh.
Like, don't be afraid to ask your providers and write down your questions. Why do you need to write it down? Trust me, write it down. Because when you go see your doctor for an appointment, the doctor will ask you a lot of questions, and by
Mhm.
the time it's your turn to ask, you would have forgotten all your questions
Mhm.
already.
Yeah.
So make sure you write your questions before coming to your appointment so that by the time when the provider asks you, do you have any questions? As a matter of fact, I do. Like, see this list? What is this drug? What is the clinical trial for this? So don't be afraid to ask those questions,
Mhm.
and also don't be afraid to ask for a second opinion.
Mhm.
It 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 will not hurt them. In fact, if I'm a provider, I would love for my patient to ask me to get a if I could refer them to another provider for a second opinion. It is your right as a patient. It is your life,
Mhm.
right? It is your life. You're making a decision for yourself, so you always ask for a second opinion, and then that's very acceptable. Some patients are afraid that they might hurt their provider's feelings if they do that. That's not true anymore.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mm.
so ask, write your questions, ask, and ask.
And that is all that we have for this
Right.
episode. I want to thank our guests, Dr. Marlon Garzo Saria and my co host Mindy Ofiana, our director and producer Radni Cahudo, Caro Robles, PNAA Chair for Communications and Marketing, our advisor, PNAA Foundation President Nancy Hoff, and our executive producers, PNAA President Dr. Marijoy Garcia Dia, and our PNAA Executive Director, Carmina Bautista. Join us here every Wednesday on Rise Up. Until then, keep on rising. See you next week. This program is made possible through the NIH All of Us Research Program. PNAAF is a national collaborator of the Asian Engagement and Recruitment Corps launched by the Asian Health Coalition, which is a national community engagement partner for the NIH All of Us Research Program.